In the previous video, I covered a little bit about security in web application. In this video, I want to cover still on high level, but I want to provide a little bit more detail in terms of the flow. So if we have a user here trying to access a web page, right? Let's imagine this login page is already loaded because the user wants to access some information that requires login, right? So the user would interact with this browser to enter the credentials, right? So once the credential is entered, a HTTP request and then is sent to the server, right? So let's use this arrow to represent the HTTP request that is sent to the server. When the server receives the credentials from the HTTP request body, it's going to then verify against a user store to make sure the credentials are correct. Why do I draw a database symbol here? That's because the user information is stored usually in the data store, right? So the credentials need to be verified against the user's data store, right? So this step will happen, and if the verification is completed correctly, that means the credentials are correct. The identity will come back. The identity information will be used to generate the security context. So let's use this rectangle to represent this verification process. Verify credentials. And then we're going to use this second rectangle to represent the process of generating the security context. So after the verification, the identities will be pulled into the web server and store those identities in the security context and then serialize that into a cookie. If you're not very familiar with the concept of cookie, I just want to add a little bit information here. A cookie can be considered as a piece of information that is stored in the header of the HTTP request and HTTP response, right? That information is going to be carried back and forth between the browser and the web server. And there is a feature with this piece of information because in the header you can contain lots of information, but the cookie is a special type of information because it can only be shared within the same domain, right? You cannot send a request to a different web server that carries the same cookie because there is a security problem. All right, let's go back to this authentication and authorization flow. So let's imagine this is a normal cookie authentication, which is very suitable for this web application, right? So then this serialized cookie will be contained in the HTTP response and then will be returned back to the browser. The browser will then redirect the user to a different page, right? And including that redirection, every single subsequent HTTP request will contain that cookie, right? So let's use another arrow to represent one of the subsequent requests, and then this rectangle will represent the authentication process. So you may ask why this is authentication where this is already the verification process is already authentication, right? So yes, this whole part here, both of these rectangles are part of authentication, right? To verify the user is who they say they are, and then generate the security context, serialize that into a cookie, sends that back to the browser. So this is all authentication process. Why do we have this authentication process again? Well, here we have it in the cookie, right? We have the security context in the cookie. The web server will have to deserialize that into the security context, and then the web server will actually know whether the user is actually logged in or not, right? So this part of deserializing the security context from the cookie is also part of authentication, right? So basically in one statement, authentication is the process to know who you are, right? So because the security context is already stored in the cookie, so in order to know at this step, in order to know who you are, it only needs to decrypt that cookie and deserialize that cookie because the cookie is encrypted. So once those happens, immediately we know whether the user is authenticated or not. So this is still the authentication process where we decrypt the cookie, we deserialize the cookie to get the security context. And then once we have the security context, which is actually contained in the HTTP context object, right? Once we have that information, then we can tell whether the user is authorized to access the information or the page it wants to see, right? So that's the second step, which is authorization, right? So authorization will happen right afterwards. And then if everything is okay, then the web server will decide to return the proper response that contains the HTML and all of the data that the user requires. From this video, I wanted to show you that both these steps as well as these are part of authentication, and then the authorization process is relatively simpler from at least conceptual level.